Welcome to In Focus with Ijaz Haider. 2 days from now, Iran will vote to elect a new president. The third televised debate has taken place, which saw a major face-off between former central bank governor Abdul Nasser Hemati and head of judiciary Ebrahim Raisi, who is considered the front-runner for president's office. The Guardian Council, a largely unelected body, though 6 of its 12 members are elected by parliament through nomination by the head of judiciary, has already knocked out many prominent candidates, notably Ali Larijani of the powerful Larijani family. Most analysts believe the system is rigged against other candidates so Raisi can win the vote. The independent reformist candidate Mohsen Mehrwalizadeh had bitterly and publicly criticized the Guardian Council for batting for Raisi. In the third and final debate on state television, Hemati criticized forces that oppose the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the technical nomenclature for the Iran nuclear deal. This was a reference to hardliners, including Saeed Jalili, who was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator from 2007 to 2013 and is a candidate in the presidential race. The candidates also talked about corruption and misgovernance, but no one seems to give a clear roadmap or talks about how the supremacy of the supreme leader creates an asymmetrical power structure and how it is difficult for any president to work outside the confines of the system. But let's get to our panel this evening. I'm joined by Professor Farhang Jahanpour. Professor Jahanpour has had a long and distinguished academic career and has been associated with the University of Oxford. I also have with me Dr. Neda Bolourchi, a postdoctoral assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers, and Tohid Asadi, a PhD candidate of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me begin with Professor Jahanpour. Professor, as I said, before we get to the specifics, the system is constructed in a way that does not and cannot allow, beyond a certain point, the president and also the parliament to actually govern or take a direction, if you will, which might be looked at as in conflict with what the supreme leader wishes. So that kind of already rigs the system. Is that something that you would agree with?
I have often stated that, contrary to those who believe in some sort of foreign intervention in Iran, Iranian destiny must be decided by the Iranians themselves. And again, contrary to the Western assumptions that there is no democracy in Iran, I think there is some form of democracy, although it is not complete. It must be stressed that Iran is one of the few countries, with Pakistan and Turkey and some others, which have at least regular presidential parliamentary elections. Many countries in the Middle East do not have any elections at all. But for an election to be democratic, it must represent the will of the people. People should be able to vote for the candidates that they want to have. And again, another characteristic of a democracy is free debate and free expression of views. Sadly, all of these are lacking in Iran. But the selection by an unelected body, as you mentioned, of mainly hardliners, right-wingers, of who can and cannot sit for election is totally undemocratic and really weakens the concept of democracy in Iran. Because, I mean, who are these people to decide that a person who has been the Speaker of the Parliament for some 10 years, the man who before was the chairman of the Expediency Council, and a few days ago we heard a former Ministry of Intelligence, شورای تشخیص مصلحت. Maslahat is the interest of the nation. The chairman of that body, the head of the intelligence, said he interfered to disqualify him because his election would have been against the interests of the system. Now, this really makes total nonsense of the whole system. People do not have a choice. The best they can do is to choose between the bad and the worse, which this unelected body has selected for them.
Right. Thank you for overview, Professor Jahanpour. And Neda Bolourchi, ironically, last time we were talking about Iran on this program, I think by the end of the program, it had been decided that Ali Larijani, and you had mentioned Ali Larijani, and he had been knocked out. So, so lots of things have happened since then. So give me your sense of where you think this is going, and is there a possibility, even if a remote one, for some kind of upset, you know, as far as Ibrahim Raisi's election is concerned?
So as I had mentioned in that last conversation, it was unconfirmed at that time that Ali Larijani was going to be eliminated from running for these elections. So I agree with Professor Jahanpour in the sense that Iranian elections have not been ever free or fair, but there has been, in a sense, sort of the idea that there were elections, there was some sort of version of what we might say quasi or pseudo-democracy, in the sense that there was the appearance of choice, and there was a variety of choice previous to this particular election. With the vast amount of eliminations that we see, we can't just talk about sort of the undemocratic nature of what is happening in Iran, but possibly why. So to your point of what might be coming down the road, I've talked about how this is probably in preparation for a change in the form of government in Iran. And so it's largely focused on who might replace the supreme leader. There has been lots of talk about how the push for Raisi is to make him president. So he has an 8-year sort of training period for preparation, to see his pitfalls, to see if he can sort of walk a fine line or not walk a fine line within the system, and how he really can be in a much larger executive position. Being the head of the shrine in Mashhad or the head of the judiciary is not quite the same as the type of executive position that the president is, and most certainly not the type of executive position that the supreme leader is. Another option is also the idea that the Guardian Council and Khamenei as the supreme leader will be eliminating the position of the president in favor of a prime minister position, which in essence what that would do is muddy the waters so much. It would weaken and basically consolidate for the conservatives all the power. The president has historically in Iran been sort of the leverage of allowing for greater domestic social practices. The president is not only important for international relations, but really domestic affairs. And so this would, if this particular election is in preparation for a transition to a premiership as opposed to a presidency, it would, without a doubt, fully consolidate power in the conservative hands. So there are a lot of possibilities about the future and how this election is pivotal in terms of either potential candidates for supreme leadership or the change to sort of how Iran is run and the roles that are available for people to vote on.
Right. Talk of experience, I think Ali Larijani probably had the most impressive CV of all the candidates. But let me get to Tohidi here. What do you think of, you know, as I said, that the form of democracy that we were talking about, or the relative lack of substance, is something that inheres in the very asymmetry of the system itself. So there is no escaping it. So unless the system is changed in ways that allow for a more sort of symmetrical power sharing, it's just not possible to have anything other than what we see. I mean, notwithstanding the presidential debates and all of that, because that's the form, and it does look good at one level, and you get a sense of catharsis saying, oh, okay, so, the space is open for people to criticize and so on, but essentially, it's just a safety valve. So give me your sense, Tohid.
Well, actually, I think the points that your other guests were mentioning were, some of them at least, very much controversial to me, because we should just pay close attention to the very fact that there might be different forms of democracy, and there might be, let's say, different political systems, but this matter of difference should not be taken and should not be mistaken for a lack of actually democracy either in Iran or any other country. So basically, when we're talking about countries, we should not consider or take a role model and expect other countries to copy and paste the same model. Iran has got its own form of democracy, its own form of complicated system of politics, and in that there are so many factors and determinants at work. And all in all, let's say political decisions made in this very complex system are coming from different backgrounds, and the leading strategies, the core policies taken is as a result of a consensus among political elites. And let's not forget the fact that these elites are selected and are actually, in better wording, are elected by people. The same people who elect a council that elects the leader, and the same people who go and select other, let's say, people who are, who play a role actually in formulation of political system and formulation of these kinds of councils. So I can say that I have some sort of disagreement about this argument that Iran lacks democracy. And then there is a further point regarding, let's say, so-called elimination of some liberal, let's say, candidates. And that comes from basically a disappointment that exists not only among Iranian ruling circle, but also among Iranian public, that, those liberal candidates with some tendencies towards West, they have just experienced a test which was not that much successful. So now we have some 5 remaining candidates coming from, let's say, different political orientations, from either left wing or right wing. So I believe, yes, there are some limitations, but we cannot put forth the claim that Iran lacks kind of democracy that is required for holding a, let's say, democratic election.
Right. Tohid Asadi, I'm going to get back to you because this whole sort of idea of, democracy as different forms is, of course, comparative politics 101, but we're talking about not just the form, but also the substance, and on that I'll go back to Professor Jahanpour. Professor Jahanpour, the idea that Iran has a different kind of system also seems to imply that this is a system that works for Iran and for the Iranian people. Now, this is obviously a very controversial argument for observers of the scene, because while you are within a country, you obviously look at it in a different way. I mean, as far as the erstwhile Soviet Union was concerned, there was a constitution and there was democracy, but we know that wasn't really the case. So give me your sense of, since you also work on language and how power structures are perpetrated and perpetuated. Give me your argument on what Tohid Asadi is saying with reference to Iranian democracy.
The point is, clearly there are different forms of democracy, even in the West. The American democracy is very different from the British one, and the British one is different from French or German. But I mean, we cannot extend these ideas to the point that they become meaningless. As Bismarck said, you are allowed to choose any color that you like, provided it is black. Here, you have got a choice of any candidate, provided that's the one that we have chosen for you. This really is nonsensical. The little credibility which Iran has in the West, and of course we have to talk about the West, it is part of the global sort of system of governance which created the idea of democracy, has been due to some limited form of democracy. When President Khatami was elected, and there was a great deal of clamor to interfere in Iran, former President Clinton said, well, look here, this is a democracy. People have chosen against the wishes of the establishment. The fact of the matter is that in Iran, of course, there are no political parties to sit and decide their own candidates. But roughly speaking, we can say there are right-wingers, which are in the majority in government. There are moderates, centrists, to which Mr. President Rouhani belonged. And there are reformists who want to change the system from within, which was represented by President Khatami and others. The fact is that in this latest election, in the previous ones, the Guardian Council allowed at least some prominent members of each of these three groupings to take part so that people had some choice. In this election, they have practically eliminated the choice because out of the 7, 5 of them, without any mistake, belong to the right, they are conservatives, they are right-wingers, and there's only Mr. Mehralizadeh and Mr. Hemmati who were not on the list of the reformists or the centrists, but can be said to be more or less moderate or centrist. So by no definition of democracy can you define this. We don't have an Islamic democracy or a Jewish democracy or a Christian democracy or a Hindu democracy. Democracy has a definition, which means the people choose their representatives freely, and they are run and governed by their own representatives rather than by appointed officials, kings, or autocrats. The present form of government, the way that they are going in Iran, sadly, is eliminating that element of democracy. And in my view, this will weaken Iran and will weaken its negotiating powers and bargaining powers in the Committee of Nations, and is not in Iran's long-term interest.
Right. Neda Bolourchi, there's another issue that I want to discuss here, which is that parallel to what's happening, Vienna talks are also going on. Now, during the third presidential debate, as I said, Hemmati, in addition to other things, with reference to Ibrahim Raisi, also said that how will the world react if power devolves to the hardliners? And he said, well, you know, you're someone who doesn't want the JCPOA, which then forced Raisi to say, no, I'm in favor of it. And nonetheless, Saeed Jalili said, no, that's not something that we should do. Then there was also the issue of the Financial Action Task Force bill that Parliament has to ratify. And Jalili also talked about that and said he does not think that it's in, to the advantage of Iran to actually get into the FATF net. So give us a sense of how this is going to pan out. I mean, some of these very important issues for Iran, for respite and reprieve to the Iranian economy, and the very idea, this whole idea of sort of misgovernance and hardships for the people is something that is deeply linked with the Iranian, or the perception of Iranian foreign policy and its role in the greater Middle East.
Well, so first, some of those candidates are alleged to be really there specifically so that Raisi will seem as more moderate than, right? We've been talking largely about right and left. That doesn't really sort of in the American or in the British sense make too much sense. And so what you have are more kind of moderates like Hamati, who is a bank technocrat, then Raisi, and then you have the ultra-conservatives who some of, I would argue, are there so that Raisi can, as you pointed out, make clear his positions, and so that he seems to actually be the more moderate choice. In terms of what he said, well, he agrees with and has responded to Jalili in terms of the JCPOA because this is not really a decision that is made by the president, right? The executive or the president's position, as well as the foreign ministry, can propose things. They negotiate with the Supreme Leader's office, but it is ultimately the Supreme Leader's office that decides on measures that will be taken. So if the Supreme Leader and his larger office and advisors have agreed that Iran will return to the JCPOA, then the president's office and by extension the foreign ministry go back and they negotiate the JCPOA as we see it. So this idea that the JCPOA will not happen if a conservative is there is not true, because it has, at the highest levels of power in Iran, been approved. How those negotiations happen, who is doing the negotiating, will change. So, yes, there is a general agreement that the JCPOA, Iran will be part of it. There are parameters about what provisions have to happen for Iran to agree on it. These are not going to change over the long term. How tangible it becomes depends on who's in the foreign ministry and who are the lead negotiators. And so, as you were sort of asking me earlier about Ali Larijani, he may actually, there may be an agreement, yes, that he got removed from the list of candidates. And by the way, let us not forget that he asked the Guardian Council, he pointed as a matter of law to the Constitution and said, you, the Guardian Council, are supposed to justify my elimination. And the Guardian Council came back and said, no, we don't have to do that. So I think, so even though he has put up a little bit of what might be called the fight, he is a chief negotiator. He signed the Iran-China deal. So we shouldn't be too surprised if we see him in one of these positions for the foreign ministry. I think it's possible. And so back to your question about what happens with the JCPOA and the foreign, the FATF, which is the major international anti-terrorism and anti-money laundering. That as well, Raisi has said that he is not opposed to it. This is a major instrument of law about financial transactions. And without it, it becomes very difficult for Iran to engage in the international financial system, even if the United States removes sanctions, right? And I've previously talked about the three major categories of sanctions. So it's the nuclear sanctions, the terrorism sanctions, and the human rights sanctions. But what also allows Iran to fully engage back into the global market is its passage not only by the president, but of course by the parliament and ultimately by the Supreme Leader's office of the FATF. And this has been stalled in Iran for years on end, not because of one particular president, but because of conservatives and parliament. And so it has increasingly the weight of not being a signatory to that legal instrument has weighed on Iran's ability, separate from, but concomitant to, attendant to the sanctions, engaging fully into the market. And so we'll see if Raisi gets elected, if there has been ultimate approval for the FATF to go through. It will significantly help Iran in the global market, but it will, of course, be a constraint on its financial transactions, which is what it's intended to do for all signatories.
Right. So this is a very interesting point. So this is like, for the last 2 or 3 years, you constantly criticize the relatively moderate president and his cabinet, and then you want the conservatives the right or ultra-right to actually do the same things. And then when the fruits of that begin to flow in, you say, well, you know, finally the Conservatives have got the economy on the right track and so on. Is that something, very quickly before I go to Asad, is that something that you would agree with?
Well, I mean, I don't think that this was a purposeful thing on the part of the Conservatives or the Supreme Leader by any stretch of the means. He gave approval for negotiations. There has been discussion and sort of these op-ed writings that you should blame American President Trump for the rightward swing of Iranian politics. You can't blame him fully in the sense that these transactions, right, that he imposed the most devastating sanctions on Iran. Absolutely. The maximum pressure policy is a failure. I know I'm taking a little bit more time than you want. It is a failure. Iran did not negotiate. Anybody who knew anything about Iran would tell you that these sanctions are not going to bring Iran to the negotiating table. It will keep going. And instead, it has gotten closer to Russia. It's gotten closer to China. So you're not going to have the idea amongst the Iranian populace that, oh, the Conservatives fixed this. You will still have the idea that Rouhani was not able to handle this sanction situation.
Right.
And, last time I was in Iran, it was, oh, yeah, Rouhani is horrible. But there is an understanding that it really was Trump, and that the Rouhani administration would have been able to do much more if not for these sanctions. But that doesn't alleviate completely the mismanagement, right? There is historically economic mismanagement there.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Neda Bolourchi speaking with us. Let me now get to Tohid Asadi. Tohid Asadi, I'm afraid that this whole idea of Iran having a peculiar system is not something that other Iranians on the panel, for instance, agree with.
I'm going to talk about JCPOA and Vienna Talks, but before that, let me quickly get back to the response that we heard from your other guests. Just quickly, 3 points came to my mind. First of all, the people who evaluate and actually announce the candidates for presidential elections are either directly or indirectly elected by people. So that could come come in accordance with any definition of democracy that
hold on. How does that work? No, you're talking about the Guardian Council?
I'm talking about both Guardian Council or other. Guardian Council is not a council acting by itself. It acts upon a complex set of reports that it receives from intelligence ministry, from different, intelligence, components of the system, and from cultural parts, from political parts. So
no, but Tohid Asadi, sorry, I mean, I'm pushing this point because 6 members of the Guardian Council are directly nominated by the Supreme Leader, and the other 6 are nominated by the head of the judiciary, and they go through the parliament. So by no stretch of the imagination, you can call it an elected body. Secondly, you're talking about intelligence inputs. Let's take the case of Ali Larijani. Neda was talking about that, and he had challenged the decision of the Guardian Council. And whereupon there were, as you know better than me, there were the entire sort of news reports and other stuff about his daughter being an American and so on and so forth. So all of that was essentially an attempt to sort of do some kind of character assassination, if you will, in order to justify his being knocked out. So, I mean, that doesn't seem like a fair process to me.
Well, I can say that there are some controversial issues regarding the election of candidates, but it's not really a legitimate, let's say, claim to put forth that it is not a democratic one. Because the leader, if you're referring to as a person who selects these people or others, they are all selected, but the term is different. Maybe in some country it would be a 4-year term, in some other country it would be a longer term. But the leader itself is elected by people who are in Persian called khobregan, and these people are elected by people. So we can claim credibly that the leader which tops the list.
That's a very long stretch, Tohid Asadi. That's a very long stretch. But let me not belabor this point anymore. Let's just quickly talk about JCPOA and get your point of view, because I have to wrap up the program also.
Well, as for JCPOA, let me just quickly bring a couple of points. It seems that your other guests and some other commentators have really forgotten the very fact that when we are talking about implementation of JCPOA, the side that could be considered as the main obstacle and as the main hindrance is the United States, which unilaterally withdraw from the deal. So with this lack of trust, I think now, especially considering Vienna talks that are taking place, it's really interesting that the two sides are talking about not a new agreement, but how to implement an already reached agreement.
Correct.
So basically, for the years down the road, no matter who wins the election, the general strategy of Iran is quite clear. It is for the United States to get back to the deal. And then let's not forget the very fact that Iran has fulfilled all of its obligations according to JCPOA, at least. Yeah. And then if we're talking about implementation of JCPOA, I think the strategies of Iran for the next government, whoever wins the election is going to be almost the same. And then the expectation is going to be almost the same. And if the United States tries to let's say, diminish this mistrust that exists in Iran-U.S. relations, the situation could be expected to be much better.
Right. Absolutely correct. I mean, as far as the letter of the JCPOA is concerned, Iran has abided by it. There were other issues on which President Trump's administration was applying the maximum pressure campaign. Thank you so much. That was Tohid Asadi speaking with us. Let me go back to Professor Jahanpour. Professor Jahanpour, I was going to come to you for the last word. So give me a summation of what we have discussed here, not the specifics, but in terms of, and I'm really interested in this, in terms of, what kind of public response do we have in Iran to the system in and through which Iran is being governed? Would the voter turnout be a good benchmark for that, i.e., if we see a low voter turnout, that it would basically say that people do not have confidence in this entire process? Is that, something that you would agree with? Or do you think that in and of itself cannot be the real benchmark?
Because I believe in change from within, and if we are going to change, we have to participate. Otherwise, we really have no right to criticize. Therefore, I believe that even with this very restrictive system that we have, people must take part and at least vote for the one which, in their view, it can serve the country best. As for the JCPOA that you mentioned, it must be remembered that before JCPOA was signed, Iran was under a whole series of UN Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7, which meant they were Iran was threat to international peace and security. By the way, let's remember that those Security Council resolutions were also signed to and agreed by Russia and China. As for what is the general summation, it is more than 100 years that Iranians have been trying for democracy. We had the constitutional revolution in 1905 to 1911. And I believe really the Iranian people are more ready than any probably nation in the Middle East for true democracy. They are educated, they are intelligent, they have gone through various stages of the constitutional revolution, then the Pahlavi period, then the Islamic revolution, and they are mature and they can make the best solution. I believe the best thing for the system, for the regime, what they call the system, to do is to allow the people a free vote, allow the people freedom of expression, allow the people freedom of choice. They will choose what is best, which is also in the interest of the general state as a whole and the government. Right. So I think I'm optimistic in the long term about Iran. I'm very disappointed about the way that the Guardian Council has gone about it, but I'm still sure that hopefully Iranian people will rise and will get true democracy that they deserve. With all that they have gone through, they really deserve better than this.
I couldn't agree more, except that I am a little more pessimistic, but thank you so much. That was Professor Farhang Jahanpour speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss a new study which says coronavirus variants can evade antibodies by spreading via supercells. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. A new study says coronavirus variants can evade antibodies by spreading via supercells. The antibodies we create after we are infected with a virus or vaccinated against it can be very powerful. A virus typically spreads within our bodies by entering a cell and using it as a factory to create copies of itself, which then burst out and find new cells to infect. Antibodies work by binding to the virus, and this can block it from attaching to and entering our cells in the first place. But what happens if a virus does not need to exit the cell in order to spread to neighboring cells? Can our antibodies be effective against it? A new study, which is still to be published, says this highly infectious coronavirus can change human cells, making them fuse with two or more nearby cells. These supercells with large merged cell bodies are excellent viral factories. To translate all this into English, I have with me Dr. Samia Altaf, a physician public health specialist, currently associated with the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and Dr. Shapa Mirza, associate professor of biology, again associated with the Lahore University of Management Sciences. So, Dr. Altaf, let's translate this into English. What does it mean? Basically, that I've got vaccinated, but this thing can still bypass whatever defenses I have. What exactly does the study say?
Ejaz, I'm not a virologist, so with that background, I will say that reading the study, it seems that the virus is the nature of the virus and the way it acts is still unpredictable, and we are now finding out that that is what it does. The research, the study is still going through the reviews, but what implications does it have for countries and for a vaccination program? I would like to refer to that, because I feel that, and there is enough information that, however ineffective the vaccines are and however, low percentage of effectiveness they have, they are still very useful for people to get. What happens to the neutralizing antibodies and what level is produced and whether they are effective or not is another matter. So I think from a public health practice point of view, what is important is that we gear up to set up systems to increase the vaccination. All of these issues are important, and I'm sure scientists, and I'm very keen, Dr. Mirza say, from the biological cellular point of view, what she understands from this. But from the public health perspective point of view, and from the mitigation strategies that we should have in place, these are issues that come later. We are in a country like Pakistan and other countries like Pakistan, we are in a continuous state of disarray in terms of how to distribute the vaccine, how to vaccinate people. So yes, the virus is changing. It seems that it primes your body's own cells to resist the neutralizing antibodies that are there. What particular mechanism they employ and what they do, I will leave to the cellular biologist to enlighten us.
Right. Dr. Mirza, what does this mean?
Well, the virus will have to come out at some point. I mean, this is the simplest explanation for this whole thing. And if you have antibodies, the antibodies are definitely going to bind to the virus. Now, speaking of the virus that's transmitting itself through the cells, like it's using cells as a vehicle, this is not new. There are lots of pathogens that are able to do that, and one of the pathogens is Listeria. It doesn't actually have to come out of the cell in order to invade a new cell. It uses a sort of a projectile movement to go from one cell to another cell. But then on the other hand, our cells have the ability to sense danger, and they themselves try to fuse together in order to either restrict or restrain the infection in one place. And at the moment, we are really not sure if that's what is happening, that the cells are coming together, they're fusing together in order to keep the virus in one place. And not only cells fuse together, but cells sometimes liberate material that tries to contain infection in one place. So at the moment, it's very difficult. And I think that this research needs more work in order to prove that it's the cell that's trying to contain infection rather than the virus trying to invade certain mechanisms in order to evade killing by or getting neutralized by the antibodies.
Right. One other question, which I think is important also with reference to what Dr. Altaf was saying as far as vaccination is concerned, as far as persuading people to get vaccinated is concerned, that is in terms of this immune evasion strategy, if you will, coronavirus is not peculiar. All viruses do that?
But a lot of pathogens are able to evade the immune system, but antibodies are not the only component of the immune system. There are other components that are at work simultaneously. So if it evades antibodies, yes, antibodies are extremely effective in killing viruses and in killing bacteria because they can immediately take these viruses or bacteria to the neutrophils, or the cells that eat up these pathogens. So in case they are missed by the antibodies, there are other cells in the body that can take place. There are other components, there are other chemicals, proteins that are liberated by these cells that are highly toxic for both viruses and bacteria. And if you are vaccinated, just know that it's not just the antibody. Your entire immune system is now aware of the fact that there is a virus which has proteins which looks like this, and every time the immune system looks at it or is introduced to it, whether it is in the form of a disease or it is in the form of another shot of vaccine, the body is going to respond to it.
So you're saying that once you get the vaccine, the body, there's a sort of communication to the body about that particular pathogen, and the body or the cells or whatever the system is retains that memory and also develops, even when you need to get vaccinated again, the body itself has also developed some response to it?
Absolutely. That's exactly how it works. That if the body sees the pathogen or if it is vaccinated, immunized, I mean, this is also another way of looking at pathogen, the entire immune system is activated. And antibodies are just one of the components. So next time around, when the body sees the same information, it is going to respond to it in multiple ways. So it's not just the antibodies, but there are other components of the immune system also that are going to take care of this insult.
Right. Dr. Altaf, we are then thrown back to the essential, and that's, that falls into the, the public health policy area. Not only the provision of vaccines, but also getting people to actually get vaccinated. And so where do we stand on that right now? One of the stories that I read this morning, in fact, was that, for instance, the Punjab government is almost running out of the vaccines. So it seems that on the one hand, we have the problem of anti-vaxxers or non-vaxxers, and on the other hand, we have the problem of the provision of the vaccine itself.
Yes, Ejaz, which is why I keep saying that, for us to get bogged down into the biology and the cellular microbiology of this, as explained so well by Dr. Mirza, is basically the tail wagging the dog. The issue is that, as Dr. Mirza has explained, human body is a very, very exquisitely tuned machine. The body, like she said, primes itself and keeps itself ready to form antibodies if there is an invasion of a known pathogen that comes into the body. But, each and every individual who's going around, doesn't need to understand that mechanism. A lot of the operations people don't need to understand that mechanism. What we need to understand and what we need to focus on very, very, seriously is the fact that what is our strategy going to be to procure vaccines, to store vaccines, to calculate how many vaccines we need, to segregate our population, because there are certain population groups, if we run out of vaccine, who are much more vulnerable than others, and have a strategy and plans to continue to vaccinate our people. I've had, over the past week, 3 or 4 days, I've had many discussions, people calling about exactly this. And I refrain particularly from talking about this because this is completely a red herring. It doesn't really matter if the nurses are calling and if the practicing doctors are calling and saying, well, we find that there is now this super spreader cells in our body. We have scientists, we have biological scientists and virologists. Certainly we are very lucky to have Dr. Mirza amongst us. But what we need to be discussing and what we need to be asking the government and what we need to be looking at the plans that, all we read about is these pronouncements in the newspapers that this is what is happening. Right. We don't see any plans, and that is what we need to be focusing on. That I think is critical, yeah.
That area we need to focus on because it's important. Thank you so much to Dr. Altaf. Thank you also to Dr. Jahanpour Mirza. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.